April 18, 1945. The Ruhr industrial heartland of Germany collapses into chaos. Smoke rises from shattered factories, roads choke with desperate civilians, and more than 300,000 German soldiers face the reality of surrender. Among them, thousands of women, auxiliary personnel, nurses, communication specialists, Luftwaffe helpers who've spent years being told that capture by American forces means certain death. Especially capture by Black American soldiers. A group of these women huddle in a basement in a town whose name the war has rendered meaningless. They're exhausted, terrified, wearing uniforms caked with dust from Allied bombardments. They hear the rumble of tank engines, the metallic clanking of treads on broken pavement. The sound grows louder, closer, inevitable. Someone whispers that they should run. Another says there's nowhere left to run. The war is over and they know it, but knowing doesn't ease the fear.
The tanks stop outside. Hatches open.
And when the soldiers emerge, these German women cannot process what they're seeing. The liberators climbing down from the olive drab Shermans are black men. African American tankers from the 761st Tank Battalion. The women stare in frozen disbelief.
Some begin to weep.
Not from relief, but from terror so profound it paralyzes rational thought. Because for years, the Nazi propaganda machine has told them that black soldiers are savages, subhuman monsters who show no mercy, who commit unspeakable atrocities. And now here they stand, real armed, and in complete control. One of the tankers, a sergeant from Alabama who's been in combat for 183 consecutive days, approaches slowly. He's seen this reaction before. He speaks in careful, measured English. Offers chocolate from his rations. Tells them through a translator that they're safe now. That no one will harm them. The women don't believe him. They cannot believe him. The disconnect between what they've been told and what stands before them is too vast to reconcile in a single moment. It will take hours, sometimes days, before the propaganda's grip loosens enough for them to understand that their liberators are not monsters.
They're men.
Tired men who've fought across 6 countries, who've lost friends, who want nothing more than to go home. Men who, despite facing discrimination in their own country, still chose to fight for freedom. Even for people who'd been taught to fear them. This is the story of those encounters, of propaganda's power and its eventual collapse when confronted with human decency. This is the story of the Ruhr Pocket, where the largest surrender in the Western theater brought hundreds of thousands face to face with truths their government had spent years hiding. The Ruhr Pocket represents one of the most decisive operations of the war's final weeks, a masterpiece of mobile warfare that trapped an entire German army group in an industrial region that once powered the Third Reich's war machine. By April 1945, Germany is dying. The Rhine has been crossed. Allied armies drive deep into the heart of the Reich from multiple directions, and Field Marshal Walther Model's army group finds itself increasingly isolated in the Ruhr region. The trap springs shut on April 1 when elements of the U.S. First Army driving northeast from the Remagen bridgehead meet the 9th Army pushing south near Lippstadt. In a matter of hours, more than 300,000 German troops find themselves encircled in a pocket roughly 50 miles across. Inside this shrinking perimeter are not just combat soldiers, but hundreds of thousands of support personnel, including women serving in auxiliary roles, communication specialists, medical staff, and Luftwaffe anti-aircraft crews. The German forces trapped inside are a shadow of what the Wehrmacht once was. Field Marshal Model commands remnants of 19 divisions, but only about 75,000 of his men have infantry weapons. Another 75,000 carry only pistols. The rest are support troops, logistics personnel, walking wounded, and civilians caught in the collapse. Ammunition runs critically low. Fuel supplies evaporate. The Luftwaffe cannot penetrate Allied air superiority to resupply the pocket. Hitler, disconnected from reality in his Berlin bunker, orders the Ruhr to become a fortress that will tie down Allied forces for months. He forbids any attempt to break out. But Model knows better. He's a capable commander who understands when a situation has become hopeless. Beginning April 14th, he starts dissolving his army group, ordering young boys and old men to remove their uniforms and go home. He wants to save lives, knowing that continued resistance will only result in pointless casualties. Combat troops receive implicit permission to surrender or attempt escape as individuals. The formal military structure crumbles. What remains is chaos, tens of thousands of frightened people waiting for the Americans to arrive. The American forces closing in on the pocket represent the most powerful military force ever assembled. They're well-equipped, well-fed, supported by overwhelming firepower and complete air superiority. And among these units are soldiers who've proven themselves in some of the war's toughest fighting. Soldiers whose skin color makes them targets of special fear among German troops who've been force-fed Nazi racial propaganda. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, arrive at the Ruhr carrying with them a combat record that would be extraordinary for any unit, regardless of race. Their journey to this moment began 3 years earlier in the segregated American South, where the simple act of training black tankers was considered controversial by military leadership skeptical that African Americans could handle the complexity of armored warfare. Activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the 761st trained for over 2 years before being deployed overseas. The extended training wasn't because they needed it, it was because white commanders didn't want to give them the chance to fight. They trained at Camp Hood, Texas, in a region where Jim Crow segregation was enforced with violence. Where black soldiers couldn't eat at the same restaurants, use the same facilities, or receive the same respect as their white counterparts. Jackie Robinson, the future baseball legend who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, was court-martialed during this period for refusing to move to the back of a military bus. The charges were eventually dropped, but the incident reflected the atmosphere these men operated in. Yet the Black Panthers trained relentlessly. They mastered the M4 Sherman tank, a reliable but vulnerable machine that would become their home in combat. They learned to coordinate with infantry, to maneuver under fire, to fight as a cohesive armored unit. By the time they shipped to Europe in October 1944, they were among the best-trained tank battalions in the U.S. Army. They just hadn't been given the chance to prove it. That chance came in November 1944 when they entered combat attached to General George Patton's Third Army. Patton, initially skeptical of black troops, gave them a rousing speech that acknowledged both his doubts and his expectation that they would exceed them. He told them their race was watching, that they couldn't let him down. It was both inspirational and revealing of the burden these men carried. They weren't just fighting Germans. They were fighting for recognition, for respect, for the right to be seen as equals. From their first engagement at Morville-Lesvic, France, through the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, the 761st compiled a record of sustained excellence. They fought for 183 consecutive days without relief, an almost unheard-of stretch for frontline units. Most combat units spend a few weeks at the front before rotating to rear areas. The Black Panthers stayed in the fight, taking 50% casualties while inflicting over 130,000 enemy casualties. They captured 30 towns, destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles, and broke through the supposedly impregnable Siegfried Line. But the Germans feared them for reasons beyond their combat effectiveness. Nazi propaganda had spent years portraying black people as subhuman, as primitive savages whose very existence threatened Western civilization. And now these same savages were operating the most sophisticated armored vehicles on the battlefield, coordinating complex combined arms operations, and winning. It was a cognitive dissonance the Nazi ideology could not reconcile. The Nazi propaganda apparatus understood human psychology remarkably well, even as its core ideology was fundamentally insane. Joseph Goebbels and his Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had spent years crafting messages tailored to specific audiences, exploiting existing prejudices, fears, and resentments. When it came to black soldiers, they had a particularly venomous campaign ready. To the German home front, black soldiers were portrayed in the most dehumanizing terms possible. Propaganda films and posters depicted them as brutish, uncivilized monsters. Newspaper articles recycled old racist tropes from World War I about black French colonial troops, amplifying stories of supposed atrocities with no basis in fact. The message was clear and consistent: black soldiers were not soldiers at all. They were animals in uniform, incapable of discipline, driven by base instincts, showing no mercy to prisoners. This propaganda built on existing prejudices. Many Germans had absorbed racist attitudes that predated the Nazi regime, attitudes common throughout the Western world in the early 20th century. Hitler himself devoted pages in Mein Kampf to ranting about black French occupation troops in the Rhineland after World War I, portraying their presence as a Jewish plot to contaminate the white race. The Nazi regime forcibly sterilized hundreds of mixed-race children born during that occupation in 1937, a horrific prelude to later atrocities. But the propaganda campaign also had a military component specifically targeting black soldiers themselves. As German defeat became inevitable, the Wehrmacht dropped millions of leaflets on Allied lines trying to encourage surrender. For African American troops, these leaflets took a different approach. They didn't depict black soldiers as savages, they tried to exploit the very real racism black soldiers faced in their own country. The leaflets pointed out the bitter truth that black soldiers were fighting for a nation that treated them as second-class citizens. That German prisoners of war in the United States often received better treatment than black American soldiers. That segregation was enforced throughout the military and civilian life. The leaflets promised that Germany had never lynched black people, that black people had always been treated decently in Germany. This was, of course, a lie. The Nazis had persecuted, imprisoned, sterilized, and murdered black people in Germany. But the leaflets counted on American racism being so egregious that even Nazi Germany might seem preferable. These two propaganda streams, the one depicting black soldiers as monsters to terrify Germans and the one promising decent treatment to encourage black soldiers to surrender, existed simultaneously without apparent concern for the contradiction. Propaganda isn't about consistency. It's about effectiveness. And by April 1945, German women and support personnel trapped in the Ruhr Pocket had been thoroughly indoctrinated in the first narrative. They genuinely believed that capture by black soldiers meant torture, rape, and death. When the 761st Tank Battalion rolled into the Ruhr Pocket as part of the encirclement operation, they encountered this fear firsthand. German soldiers attempting to surrender would see black tankers emerging from their vehicles and react with terror. Some would scream and run away. Others would freeze, visibly shaking, unable to process the disconnect between the propaganda and the reality of professional soldiers accepting their surrender according to the rules of war. The Black Panthers learned to adapt. They developed a tactic of staying inside their tanks until German troops came close enough to surrender, only then emerging so the Germans wouldn't see their skin color from a distance and flee. It was a pragmatic solution to an absurd problem created by years of racist propaganda. One German officer, upon surrendering to the 761st, asked in genuine confusion, "How many Negro Panzer divisions are there?" He'd encountered black armored forces and couldn't reconcile this with everything he'd been told about black people being incapable of operating complex machinery. The question revealed how completely the propaganda had warped reality in the minds of German soldiers. For German women, the encounters were even more charged with fear. Women serving in auxiliary roles, in communications, in medical support, had been told repeatedly that capture by any Allied forces was dangerous, but capture by black soldiers was a fate worse than death. They'd been fed a steady diet of propaganda about black soldiers as rapists and murderers. When American tanks appeared with black crews, some women became hysterical. Technical Sergeant Warren Cressy, one of the 761 SD's most decorated soldiers, later recalled encountering groups of German women who cowered in basements, refusing to come out, certain they were about to be killed. He and his fellow tankers would have to spend time, sometimes hours, convincing them through translators that they were safe. They'd offer food, medical supplies, show them there was nothing to fear. Slowly, incrementally, the propaganda's hold would weaken. The process of deprogramming wasn't quick. These women had spent years being told these things. The fear was genuine and deep. But reality has a way of undermining even the most sophisticated propaganda. The black soldiers of the 761st weren't monsters. They were professional soldiers doing a job. Many were remarkably kind, sharing their rations with starving civilians, providing medical care, going out of their way to reassure terrified prisoners that the war was over and they would be treated humanely. This contrast between expectation and reality created profound cognitive dissonance. One woman interviewed after the war recalled her first encounter with black American soldiers. She'd been hiding in a cellar with other women, praying, convinced her life was over. When the soldiers appeared and one offered her chocolate, she couldn't comprehend it. She stared at the chocolate bar like it was an object from another planet. The soldier, seeing her confusion, simply placed it in her hand and moved on. It took her an hour, she said, before she could bring herself to eat it. And when she did, something fundamental shifted in her understanding. The irony of these encounters was not lost on the black soldiers involved. Here they were, being feared as savages by people who'd been part of a regime that committed industrial genocide, who'd waged a war of extermination across Europe. And these same black soldiers, having fought their way across a continent, were treating their defeated enemies with more humanity than many of them received in their own country. The bitter reality is that German prisoners of war held in the United States during the war were often treated better than black American soldiers. There are documented cases of German POWs being allowed into restaurants and facilities that black soldiers were barred from entering. German POWs received access to church services that black soldiers were denied. This wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. It happened across the country, a testament to how deeply embedded racism was in American society. Black soldiers were well aware of this cruel irony. They were fighting fascism abroad while facing discrimination at home. They were liberating Europe while knowing they'd return to a segregated America where they'd be expected to ride in the back of buses, use separate facilities, accept second-class citizenship. Some German prisoners, upon being released after the war, expressed shock at how black American soldiers were treated. They'd been told America was the land of freedom and equality, and then they witnessed black soldiers being subjected to treatment that violated those principles. The 761st Tank Battalion's experience in the Ruhr Pocket was relatively brief. The encirclement operation moved quickly, and by April 18, organized German resistance in the pocket had collapsed. Field Marshal Model, unable to accept surrender, walked into a forest and shot himself. His soldiers, following his final orders, either surrendered or attempted to make their way home. The Black Panthers moved on, continuing their advance deeper into Germany. On May 2, 1945, the 761st encountered something that put all previous experiences into stark perspective. They arrived at Gunskirchen concentration camp, a subcamp of Mauthausen in Austria. The SS guards had fled days earlier, leaving behind more than 15,000 Hungarian Jews in conditions of unimaginable suffering. The tankers of the 761st were among the first American forces to liberate prisoners from a Nazi concentration camp. What they saw there haunted them for the rest of their lives. Emaciated bodies that were barely alive, piles of corpses, the physical evidence of systematic murder on an industrial scale. The Black Panthers, who'd just spent weeks being feared as savages by Germans, now witnessed the actual savagery of the Nazi regime. They did everything they could to help, sharing their rations, providing medical supplies, trying to comfort people who'd survived the unsurvivable.
But they couldn't stay long. Orders came to move on.
The war was ending, but it wasn't over yet. On May 5, 1945, the 761st celebrated the German surrender. They'd been in continuous combat for 183 days, longer than almost any other American unit. They'd suffered 50% casualties, 34 killed in action, hundreds wounded. They'd received 1 Medal of Honor, 11 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, and 296 Purple Hearts. They'd proven beyond any doubt that black soldiers could fight as effectively as any troops in the world. But when they returned home in 1946, there were no parades for the Black Panthers. No ticker tape celebrations, no hometown heroes' welcomes. They returned to a country that was still segregated, that still treated them as second-class citizens. Men who'd fought across Europe, who'd liberated concentration camps, who defeated the Nazi regime, went back to being told where they could and couldn't sit, where they could and couldn't eat, what facilities they could and couldn't use. It would take decades for their service to receive proper recognition. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter belatedly awarded the 761st Tank Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. In 1997, 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, who'd been killed in action in 1944, received the Medal of Honor after a review found that black soldiers had been systematically denied recognition they'd earned. The story of German prisoners' fear of black liberators reveals layers of irony and tragedy. It shows the power of propaganda to override reality, to make people fear their rescuers and trust their oppressors. It highlights the absurdity of Nazi racial ideology, which portrayed black people as inferior while black soldiers operated the most advanced military technology of the era. And it underscores the courage and professionalism of black soldiers who fought for a country that didn't fully embrace them, who treated defeated enemies with humanity even while facing discrimination at home. The women in that basement in the Ruhr in April 1945 eventually learned the truth. The black soldiers they feared weren't monsters. They were liberators. Men who'd crossed an ocean, fought across a continent, and helped destroy one of the most evil regimes in human history. Men who, despite every reason to be bitter, still believed enough in freedom and justice to fight for it. Men who proved that the content of someone's character has nothing to do with the color of their skin. The 761st Tank Battalion's legacy extends beyond their military achievements. They helped pave the way for military desegregation, which came in 1948 when President Truman signed Executive Order 9981. They demonstrated that integration could work in the military's most demanding roles. They showed that excellence and courage know no racial boundaries. And they left a record of service that stands as a rebuke to every prejudiced assumption about what black soldiers could or couldn't do. Today, when we examine those encounters in the Ruhr Pocket between terrified German prisoners and their black American liberators, we see a moment where propaganda confronted reality and lost. Where manufactured fear gave way to human decency. Where people who'd been taught to hate learned instead about common humanity.
It wasn't a quick lesson. It wasn't an easy one. But it was real. And it mattered.
Because sometimes the most powerful weapon against lies isn't another lie. It's simply the truth, embodied in people who refuse to become what others fear they are, who instead choose to be who they know themselves to be.
Soldiers. Liberators.
Heroes who deserved better from both the enemies they defeated and the country they served.